Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Engage People and Drive Change. I'm Jonathan Banks, and today we're looking at the recent Supreme Court ruling that struck against affirmative action and seeing some of the ramifications of that related to DEI, especially thinking about how we're measuring DEI. Environment, social, and governance has been a very powerful way of measuring DEI, which is very important to think about in light of that Supreme Court ruling. We're going to talk about that today on Engage People and Drive Change. Thanks for joining us once again. And well, we're in person this week. Welcome, Ada.
Welcome. Good to be in person. We actually didn't really realize we're kind of color coordinating too. So
hey, these things just kind of happen naturally when you get the vibes like us.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to be here with you.
Yes, likewise.
Welcome to the United States. Welcome back.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you here. And you came just a week after the Supreme Court of the United States took some action against affirmative action, and it's got a lot of people thinking about, okay, what are the ramifications of this for colleges? What is this for recruiting, hiring, retention? How does this impact diversity, equity, and inclusion overall? And one of the things that I found really interesting about that was the focus on measurement and measurability of affirmative action that came out in that ruling. So I want to talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah, no, that's a really good topic, very relevant to what's happening right now for sure.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. Just a couple shameless plugs before we get into the conversation. Once again, the Our Best World Conference is coming up August 17th in St. Paul, Minnesota at Como Zoo and Observatory. So please go ahead and check that out. Also check out Catalyst Advantage at ncxt.co to learn more about that. So wanted to just get those out there. But Maida, how was the trip over? How are you feeling?
Mostly okay with the jet lag. Sometimes it's good because I get to just my body just shuts down and sleep at 10 or 11. Usually I stay up really late, just as you know.
That's true.
So good and bad, but definitely adjusting pretty well. There's some mishap with the travel, but it's really not too bad compared to stuff that my friends kind of go through sometimes. So I feel pretty good, but excited to be here. So
good. I'm glad you made it in one piece and have all your stuff with you. got everything over. Okay, good. Well, we want to talk about the connection between diversity, equity, and inclusion. And next we say anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of the ways of measuring that. And as we just kind of mentioned at the top of the show, one of the main things that the court said about affirmative action was, the court didn't have a way of objectively measuring whether or not the actions of these universities were effective or not, or were living up to what they were proclaimed to be doing, which I think is definitely arguable.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I could see, but that the Supreme Court has its way of seeing things. And next, we kind of saw this coming a while ago, so we looked at environment, social, and governance as a way of measuring everything we do here. And especially when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what are some ways that people might draw a connection between those two diversity, equity, and inclusion, and environment, social, and governance?
Yeah, it really depends on the lens that you take to look at it, because DEI is really focused. If you look at, let me track back. If you look at environment, social, governance, I think some folks group DEI under the S part of it, social piece of it, and maybe a little bit of governance, because there is, there's definitely debate or arguments whether or not DEI should be political or not. But of course, I think everything is political, right? So we can't really shy away from talking about politics. It really impacts all of us at any level and any part of our lives, So that's how I think some folks draw the connection. But for us, I suppose it really is more about the impact that ESG and DEI and even CSR has on the community, right? So how does like sustainable efforts. I mean, you can't just talk about environment without talking about people.
Right.
So it really goes back to the impact of the people. So even if you want to talk about improving sustainable efforts in like energy and all of that, like in the US especially, the best way to track impact of environmental issues is actually tracking demographic data. So the more, if you're a person of color, especially if you're a part of the Black community, you tend to be placed in more not environmentally friendly situations. Right. So there's a lot of like intersections and intertwined areas between DEI and ESG and even CSR, which is not the main point of the conversation, but I think it really goes back to the impact, right? And so that's how I will make that connection.
Yeah, I think that's a really great connection, and I think that's where we want to place those measurements too. You know, a lot of the things is like, okay, so if we take this action, what is the result going to be, and how are we going to measure that? And as you said, you know, a lot of times DEI falls under social, but you look at something like environmental racism, you know, something along those lines, which would fall under the environmental side of things. And so it's really continues to be, as we look into the world of change and trying to make a better world to live in, it's similar to the focus that we have at Next, which is DEI goes across everything. Everything you do has DEI involved in it. We have to be starting from that foundation and finding ways to make sure that the work that we do is measurable with a global perspective. So one of the things that'll be interesting, I think, is for colleges to be looking at facets of students and saying, you know, was your family impacted by redlining? You know, is your heritage of a enslaved, you know, people, you know, those types of things, going beyond skin color, ethnicity, and race, but to really dive into the knowledge that we should all have about the impacts of people's past, impacts of current and historical racism and disadvantages, and really just understanding what those are particularly, because then we can measure changes. We can measure changes that happen because of that. You know, is a goal that we have is by, you know, passing students out of this school to reduce economic disparities across, you know, people with these types of backgrounds, right? And that's some of what we look at when we're talking about measuring the work that we do at ESG.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I think I have a greater focus in the DEI lens side of things, and you have a greater focus. I mean, of course, both, but more on the ESG side of things. So I'll be curious to hear your perspective as well as to how DEI and ESG intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think anytime that we're looking at the intersection, for me, DEI is going to be serving the measurements of ESG. So the actions, the strategies, the inequities, you know, the types of things that you're trying to do to increase belongingness and make sure that folks are really included and bringing them full selves to their neighborhoods, communities, workplaces, all of those things get measured by ESG. So for instance, if we're doing a program that is going to increase people's ability to determine whether a microaggression is happening and to be able to combat that, counteract it, you know, improve in that area. One thing that we're going to look at improving from a measurement standpoint is retention, especially retention of employees that have disadvantaged backgrounds. And so if, you know, we decrease microaggressions, the whole idea, Meta, is that we're going to make it more likely that people are going to stay in the workplace. And so that's a connection that I draw and how I see those different frameworks coming together.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll be curious to see what points of measure they were talking about that they couldn't like see or discover. There's so much data out there, and I think it's a matter of like, I mean, I think sometimes like even if there is data out there, they can still in a way choose to not accept the data, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
well, and there definitely was some of that involved, of you know, just not accepting it or looking at it with a very myopic lens. So it's actually a pretty thrilling read to go through that whole brief. It's, a lot of pages, but just looking at being able to really tie the disadvantage to the person.
Right.
And it isn't always shared between identities, and I think we all know that, because that's where stereotyping comes in, where we try to avoid the stereotyping that happens because of someone's race or whatever it might be. But also there's certain things that are just inherent to race that should be recognized too. And I think that is one of the things that was lost on members of the court.
Yeah, I think one thing that I, in a way, fear that this kind of decision would enhance is, I mean, even with DEI, ESG in place, I've heard quite a lot of folks in the organizations that we work with. I mean, it's normal to have this reaction, but people always kind of say, well, I don't really care about the background, it's more about hiring the most qualified person, right? But I think that doesn't recognize that there are systemic barriers for folks with marginalized backgrounds, that we are qualified, but we are not getting into the door in the first place. And so that was the whole point of affirmative action. And so, and I think it's just the way that things were implemented or deployed, that people have these like connotations of what that means. And I mean, actually, like, white women benefit the most from affirmative action. Right. And so I think it's gonna set us back quite a bit here. So
and one of the things we talked about at Next was, well, how does this change how we create our best world because of this decision? And I think just it was interesting to me that the three dissenting voices on the court, one of them was a white woman. And so it's interesting that you bring up the beneficiary from affirmative action there, because I was like, it's an interesting dynamic to look at over the terms of history, the interplay of white women and racism, especially in America, which I'm most familiar with. It's very much an ally and also sometimes not an ally too. And so, it was just very interesting to see how the court aligned there. I think we just have to understand from this too, is that things like ESG are so important. Things like having these globally recognized standards of measuring the work that you do are so important to have. And even above that, you got to have DEI at the root of your organization.
Yeah.
The scenario that you brought up, we're trying to hire the most qualified people. Well, we're working with a city right now who, of course, they want to hire the most qualified people, but they also want to serve their city in the best way possible. And if you're hiring the most qualified people that have no relationship culturally to the people in your city, there's a lot of extra work that you're going to be doing to actually provide a great service to that city. And so one of the things that you have to think about is that alignment from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective with the people that you intend to benefit. And that's the whole alignment that you need for creating our best world, is to understand the people who you're serving, how you intend to benefit them, how they want to receive a benefit, and aligning your workforce to that. So, the cultural, racial, identity makeup of your organization is very important for that type of alignment. And again, this is something that you want to be able to measure, right? You want to be able to measure more community organization alignment because of the DEI efforts that you have in place.
Yeah, for sure, I agree with that. Yeah, I think something you touched upon is you're most familiar with like the US side of things. And actually, I think decisions that are made in the US do become, as much as I hate the word, like trends, like all over the world. I mean, that was what the DEI space is all about, and it did create its ripples all over the world. And I think that same connotation around like hiring the most qualified person was actually something that I've heard before in Singapore. So yeah, I mean, US is like the world leader in things, in not just like political or economic, but like corporation and best practices around things as well. So I think it has, again, like such a big impact around the world on like that connotation.
Yeah, it's sort of a ripple effect and impact. But one of the interesting things about Singapore is, I think in Singapore you do have quote racial quotas by law, don't you?
So it's really interesting. So like you have quotas for the number of local versus expats,
Okay.
and it doesn't really capture like racial data.
Okay.
And yeah, it's interesting because they have that quota system, but they don't have, or they actually, when you want to try and gather demographic data, it becomes like a very sensitive touch subject that
Yeah.
people don't really want to like reach upon because
That's similar to here too.
yeah, and I mean it's unless it's something that's like posed by the government, which is the expat versus like local quota.
An expat, do you mean?
Any folks that are from the U.S. or from even Korea, China, like
Basically, any
they're
immigrant?
not, yeah, any immigrant, but yeah, like highly skilled immigrant. They have to call themselves expats, you know, so
Okay.
a separate category, but yeah.
Got you. Well, in a lot of countries around the world, they have some sort of quota in place that can be racial or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that's good to get the perspective of what's going on in Singapore too.
Yeah, well, actually, they do have. Yeah, that's why it's funny because they do have racial quotas for housing, just to make sure that local folks can integrate, and that doesn't include expat folks. It's very multi-layered and interesting to say the least. So yeah, in different areas, they do have like certain quotas of different racial demographics for like different reasons. But I think in the workplace, yeah, it's just like really multi-layered and difficult to, or like I think sometimes people would say like, oh, we are diverse, we have people from all over the world, but it doesn't really touch. They don't want to say the word white, or they don't want to say Caucasian, you know. So I think there is that element as well of sensitivity from folks.
Yeah. Well, and I think knowledge is helpful in determining like what your next steps are going to be. So if you don't know, it's kind of hard to take the next steps that are going to be effective. And sometimes it's just by design. Sometimes that's by your stage of development of wherever you're at. I know that there's a lot of organizations that really struggle on collecting that information as well. And if they collect it, then using it in a way that's helpful. And that's kind of the thing, whether it's affirmative action or whether it's racial quotas or whatever it is, it's kind of like who is going to wield that tool, because it can go both ways. It can be positive or negative, and it really depends on the people who are in charge of implementing the policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's pretty clear here that when we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to relate that to global standards and ways of measuring it, like environment, social, and governance. Thanks for bringing this topic today.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was really fun. Once again, we have the Our Best World Conference coming up on August 17th in St. Paul. Hopefully everybody can check that out and join if possible. Maida, it's been so great being with you here in person today.
Yeah, for sure. I'm very excited to be here in the next 2 to 3 weeks to do more of these shows and work in person with you. It's been like 1.5 years, so
Yeah, it's time's overdue for that for sure. And if you're in the area, connect with Maida.
Yeah.
See if y'all can get together.
My name is pretty unique, so I think you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and we'll catch you next time on Engage People and Drive Change. Bye.
Bye.